Now, in the rendering that we have for this scene, even using some of the default materials in a material editor, again, we have some reflections that are being produced. Now, we can turn off reflections in the renderer if we like, and our rendering will go a lot faster. But then we won't see reflections at all in any of our objects as we are experimenting with different materials. And I'd like to keep our rendering times down as much as possible. So what I'd like to do then is to progressively add materials, possibly that have reflections on them or not, but to start from a base. And the base material is something very similar to what we used last week when we looked at lighting. So let's look at how we would create a base material like that. So we're going to click on this next row here. We'll name this material. I've named this AO default. It's short for Ambient Occlusion Default. And in a moment I'll show you how to turn on this effect called Ambient Occlusion. So in this case, we're actually going to use an Arch and Design material. And one of the ways of using an Arch and Design material in a way that's very easy and effective is to use the templates that are provided for you. And in this case here, since it's just a very simple material that we want, we're just going to use a matte finish. And then perhaps change the color from this medium gray to a lighter gray. So I'm going to actually apply this material to all the objects in my scene. So I select them all, and in my material editor, with the material selected, I'll just use this button here, which is Apply Material to Selection. So now all those objects have that default material. And here's the end result of that rendering. You can see it's pretty bland, but it's a starting point. Now, I did name this material AO for ambient occlusion. There is a place in these rollouts where you can adjust ambient occlusion, but once again, in the templates, there is a tool here in the advanced tools called Enable Details Enhancement, and that essentially is turning on ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is essentially the deepening of shadows when you get into crevices, and we'll need to have final gather on so that we can actually see this. So let's go ahead and go back to the rendering window, turn on Final Gather, and re-render. Now you can see this ambient occluded shadows more predominantly here underneath these vases. And let me just go back and create another rendering of the before scene so we can see before and after shots. So we'll create a clone of the scene before we do a rendering with ambient occlusion and final gather on. So here's our rendering after, and let's just compare these two. Now you can see there's an overall brightening of the scene, and we'll reduce that at some point. But here, I just want you to notice underneath the vases, we're getting a nice kind of gradation of the shadows, and it's very dark here in where the vase essentially is touching the floor. So that's kind of like where the ambient occlusion shadows are going to improve the scene. And you would normally see this also in where the two walls meet here, but that's being kind of blown out by our illumination at this point. So let's do a couple more things at the material level so that we can see this ambient occlusion effect. We're going to change the value of the material's brightness down a little bit from approximately 3/4 to 50%. And also in the rollout in the Arch and Design, we're going to right click and go to Special Effects. This is where ambient occlusion's parameters are actually located, and you can see by virtue of the fact that we selected it in the template that it is on. This calculation here, max distance, is the distance that it checks for, if you would, these crevices. The higher the value, the better ambient occlusion you'll get, although there are some limits to that. I find here something in the range of 100 centimeters, or about 3 feet, is more than enough. So adjusting that material will adjust all the objects in our scene. So let's go ahead and re-render. And now once this is complete, you can see we still have the shadows underneath the vases, but we're also starting to get here a bit of a crevice shadow where the two walls are intersecting. Now, just as a quick example, I've imported the Le Corbusier chair into our scene and removed the other objects. And just to see the difference, when you turn on ambient occlusion, you can see the shadows here are very pronounced, very dark in some cases. Now let's go ahead and go back to the material, turn on ambient occlusion. So you can see here, compared to the clone, the shadows in the ambient occlusion render are a lot more interesting and more realistic. You can see we're getting a little bit of a crevice shadow here along this edge. And also, actually in the background, you can see it here along the joint between the floor and the walls. So let's look at one other thing in the Arch and Design material before we move on, and we will come back to the Arch and Design material later on. There is a parameter in the Arch and Design material which allows you to round off edges of sharp objects. If you look at most things in reality, things do not have perfectly sharp edges. And when you look at pictures, you will typically find that there will be highlights along edges of objects. In the special effects rollout of the Arch and Design material, there is a parameter here called round corners. And basically what that is doing is it's taking an object, let's say like a box, and rounding off its edges. So let's go ahead and actually copy this object. And we'll give that a different name. We'll just call that AO round edges. Just so we can distinguish it a bit, let's give it a slightly different color. A little bit blue. And go back down to Special Effects. Turn on Round Corners. And here you specify basically the radius of your corners. In centimeters, let's try something like 5 centimeters. So we'll select the box and we'll assign the material. So let's bring up the render dialog and let's go ahead and render a region. And let's only render this area here. Let's go ahead and clone this too, so we can make a comparison afterwards. So you can see the effect of having rounded off the edges, and it still looks a little rough here, but it does look round rather than squarish. I think the reason why it's a bit rough is because of our image precision. So let's go ahead and change that and re-render. So you can see this is looking a lot better now.